Here we are back to go ahead and reassemble this HTC One M7. I'm going to use some 3M double-sided sticky tape to really tape down the LCD on this phone. I want to use a thinner version. It's going to be the 1 millimeter in width. You can see all the way around. I've cleaned the frame off, make sure there's no sticky tape, there's no residue on the housing of the HTC One. And double checking, making sure that the frame is clean. We're going to make sure that we get as much adhesive on there as we possibly can as we go around. Now, just in case if you're doing this and sometimes the housing can become a little bit bent and it's much harder to get the new 3M double-sided tape to adhere, you can use some silicone sealant or possibly some super glue. I don't like to use super glue because it's pretty fragile. If you drop your phone, it might break or shatter the super glue, and then your screen just pops out anyways. So I like to use this 3M double-sided sticky tape. We're just going to go ahead and lay it down and kind of cut it to fit, making sure that using this dental pick that it's on there nice and tight. It is a pretty thin bezel on this phone where it connects to the side of the kind of the housing area. So you want to make sure that you get as close to the corners as you can without actually going up. We want it to sit nice and flush when we are finished. So just pulling the reel off here, and we'll just go ahead and cut. This tape's not really expensive. You can find it a roll off of eBay for maybe $6 or $7. Definitely nothing too crazy, but it's not normally something you have lying around. There are other types of adhesive out there that you can use. Like I was saying, sometimes I use a small amount of super glue in a tricky corner. I'd really prefer to use a actual silicone glue, something like goop or something of that nature. So again, just making sure that we stick this down nice and tight to the frame and stopping in the corners and just using a razor blade to go ahead and cut it to the exact fit that we are looking for. Again, like I was saying, making sure that if you had a shattered screen or anything of that nature, that there's no glass that's left around the housing. Make sure you take a lot of time to clean it up, and make sure that you remove all of the kind of the ridges or anything that might be left over. Sometimes when you take the back off, I've noticed on this particular phone, since I was a little bit more forceful with it, some of the plastic housing kind of came up on the inside. There's a little bit of a ridge, and I just used my dental pick to push it down just to make sure it's nice and flat when I go to put the LCD assembly back in. Making sure we get this nice and tight. Definitely don't want any ripples or bubbles in the tape. So taking the dental pick and sliding it down, making sure that it's adhered very well. Some replacement screens that you buy does come with some new tape. If you have that, it's basically just a one-piece sheet of 3M tape. You can definitely use that to put it on. This particular one that I purchased did not come with the actual frame tape, so I'm just cutting it to fit. This really, I like this 3M double-sided tape. It's pretty easy to use, and it stays pretty sticky for quite some time. So again, just making sure, running my finger down the side to make sure the tape isn't going up the side of the housing. I want it to lay nice and flat on the inside. We just have one more piece of tape to put down before we start tinkering with our new screen. Alright, our last one's put down. We're just going to go ahead and cut it to fit exactly how we want it to. Alright, that looks good. We got our tape nice and adhered. Double checking the inside to make sure that it hasn't overlapped to the inside of the housing as well. We don't want any depression spots within the new assembly when we put it on for the LCD. We're just going to go ahead and peel up the tape piece by piece to go ahead and release the adhesive. I find it easy to peel this tape up if you press down on the corners a little bit and then pull back the top. Sometimes it'll try to pull up when you remove just the top housing. So if you give it a nice good depression right at the very beginning before you pull up one edge, you won't have any issues removing the backing of the tape. Alright, our housing is looking nice. We have our new LCD here. You can definitely see that it's not cracked like the last one. We're just going to double check the ribbon cables, and we'll go ahead and just insert it here. Make sure each one goes in. I'm going to put it as far down onto the LCD as possible on the housing before we put the top in. And make sure that the frame fits nicely, it's nice and snug all the way around before you really start pushing it together. As this rubberized adhesive is pretty sticky, make sure we're just going to pull the LCD cable all the way through. Looks like it didn't come all the way through in the initial part, so give it a little tug and see if we can't get it through if we start really sticking down the housing. Alright. We have it in there, nice and snug, so we're just going to go around the edges and the corners, making sure everything fits together nicely, pressing it down all the way around all the seams. Kind of run your fingers down and kind of press into it all the way around. Really the trick is the corners and right in the middle of the sides. The middle of the sides always seem to have an issue when you use this tape on a thin bezel. So normally if I was to use any sort of additional adhesive, that's where I'd use it. It's just on kind of the side areas. That'll hold the rest of the phone down. So we have our screen in. We're doing great. We're making great progress. So the next thing we're going to need to do is remove the little foam adhesive portions off of our old LCD. You can see them, they're right here. I'm just going to transfer this to the new phone LCD. I'm going to use just a nice sharp blade to go ahead and remove them off the old LCD, making sure that I keep the adhesive intact as I remove it. Which that is kind of tricky, so just take your time. Now if it does come up, you can use a little extra adhesive or maybe even some of that 3M double-sided tape to hold this back into the back of the phone. Remove a little bit of residue there from the battery. We'll go ahead and put that foam in there. Definitely don't want to have any issues with our ribbon cables after we reassemble the phone, so make sure you transfer this onto your new LCD. Go ahead and put our next piece of foam onto the phone. Alright, we are making really good progress here. Our LCD is in, we got our film on. The next thing that we need to do is just go ahead and double check some of these wires, move them out of the way, and prep the back of the phone to get prepared to insert the battery back in before we go too much further. Here's our battery. We want to make sure that we didn't deform it, so just make sure it's nice and straight. Anywhere you pry it on the battery to pull it out with all that adhesive on it, make sure that there's no ripples or ridges in there. So you go ahead and put that first logic board back in. It fits nice and snug. Make sure all the cables are out of the way. Before you start pressing it down back onto the adhesive that's still within the housing. There's so much adhesive that really will stick right back in without any issue. And here is our logic board that we removed, so we're going to go ahead and reinsert this onto the phone as well. Double checking to make sure our ribbon cable is here. We're going to put down our fabric metal adhesive tape that was there that held the bottom of the board back in, just to give it that buffer that it was looking for in between the two. Just trying to get the tape to peel up from where it was adhered itself to the phone. It's not extremely important that it retains its adhesive property at this point, but you definitely want to kind of disperse it back out onto the battery. Kind of bend our copper shielding back into place. And there's a little bit of a keyhole at the bottom on that screw port to kind of fit into a almost a washer or a bracket. So insert the bottom part of the logic board first, and then work your way up to the top parts. Just kind of pull back all the connectors and make sure the screw holes line up. Kind of re-adhering the copper shielding on each side that kind of pulled up when you pull the logic board off. Alright, seems very nice and snug back onto the battery, so we're going to go ahead and put our screws back in. We'll start from the top up here and do our upper screw first. Here it goes in our second screw. Our third screw. Even though I drew a diagram, I got a little confused there for a second, so that's why it's always good to make sure you understand where all these screws go. Now when you are screwing these back down, they don't have to be extremely tight. We definitely don't want to damage the logic board or the screw holes. Don't strip out your screws, so just make sure they're nice and snug. They don't have to be extremely tight. The goal is that it's going to hold the logic board down against any impact or anything like that if the phone's dropped. So it doesn't have to be extremely tight. Just make sure that they're nice and snug. Alright, now what we can do is go ahead and put our connectors back onto the logic board. I'll start at the top one first. Peeling back our adhesive there so we can get it to stick down. It's having a little bit of a trouble connecting. Sometimes these ribbon cables can be a little bit tricky. This one I noticed doesn't necessarily snap into place. It kind of just settles in. So if you're looking for that snap that you get from a lot of other ribbon cables, you may not hear it, but it does have the two screws to make sure it is held down. So make sure you go ahead and put those in before you re-adhere that metal fabric adhesive. We'll go ahead and put our two wire connectors back on as well, the blue and gray ones. The shorter one goes within the closest connector to you, and the longer one, the blue one, will kind of swing out a little bit further, just right below where the gray one connected. I think these cables are by far the most hated part of any phone for me, just because they can be such a pain to get reconnected sometimes. Especially on this phone, it's in a pretty tight space. Getting it to line up and then putting the pressure on it to make it snap, but not too much to break it. Another little gray connector right here. We're going to go ahead and reattach to the logic board. Our long black connector, we're going to go ahead and just reattach this to its correct spot down here at the bottom of this logic board. I'm going to go ahead and insert this ribbon cable into its slide connector here. And once you get it to slide exactly into place, you can then flip down the little black connector. Now you want to make sure these are inserted extremely far as you can get them to go in. You definitely don't want these to pop back out after you put the phone back together, because you don't want to have to remove that back again. I'm going to reattach our LCD connector. We'll go underneath the black wire cable, so you can attach that after you attach this LCD cable. Might make it a little bit easier. Start on the other side and then put the connectors back on. I'll go ahead and put the battery back onto the logic board here. We'll need to go ahead and put the batteries back in that was holding this connector onto the logic board. Go ahead and put our additional LCD assembly connector in. And then push the snap for the connector down. And our last ribbon connector here. And snap that down as well. Just kind of re-adhere all the tape, make sure that it's pretty close to the way that you disassembled it. Any tape that goes over any of the connectors that you want to go ahead and put back on. Just double checking the LCD, make sure it's stuck on nice and tight. Now that's had a little bit of time to settle. Double checking the middle of the sides there. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and power the device on to make sure the LCD works before we put the back on. Now, I would highly suggest before you go much further than this, that you make sure everything is functioning on the phone. We removed a lot of wire connectors and ribbon cables off the back of the phone. So check your Bluetooth, check your wireless internet, check your subscriber connection, make sure the digitizer functions, make sure that everything on this phone functions. The rear camera, the front camera. You don't want to have to disassemble this phone. So instead of going through all of those with you, I'm going to take a few seconds myself to go ahead and just double check this phone, make sure that everything is completely functional before we go too much further. You can see that the touchscreen is responding for us and it's looking great. So you'll see the video jump just to the next portion right after I get done testing all the settings within the phone. Alright, we are back. I went ahead and just double checked the phone to make sure everything is functioning correctly, which it was. And we connected all of our wire connectors correctly. What we do want to do next is just go ahead and put the rest of the remaining tape onto the back of the phone for the connectors that we removed. there's a couple black pieces of tape that go over a connector, a little metal fabric piece of tape, just to make sure everything's held back in place. Just so that everything's still functioning properly for us. Go ahead and power off the device before we start moving forward. Just getting this ribbon cable nice and taut, kind of pulling it down and then putting this over the black wire connector. Try to get it to hold into place. When you put the back on, you don't have anything getting in the way or moving around as you try to snap it back into place. Piece of tape goes over this connector here as well. Remove this connector and go ahead and put our fabric piece on these bottom two here. This tape does respond to a little bit of like heat rubbing. If you were to heat it up just a little bit, gets its kind of stickiness back. Let's go ahead and reinsert this cable. Alright, and just one last piece of tape to go over this connector. Now you can put all these pieces of tape down before you test the device. I just won't have to remove them for if I have to do anything with the touchscreen, as they'll really lose any stickiness they have. What you can use, I've used a little bit of Scotch tape in the past, definitely nothing too crazy to do. So we're just going to double check this back. We see that we have it here. We have the volume and the power button are actually still adhered to the frame as it came. I'm going to leave them attached. You can do this when you reassemble the phone as well. Maybe you just use a little bit of tape if your back's still in good condition to hold the buttons in place. Makes it a lot easier. Make sure you remove the camera film cover if you bought a new back. You definitely don't want every picture you take being blue or yellow. Just making sure that there's nothing in the way that would mess up the reinstallation of the back to the top of the device. Make sure everything's back in place, the power button. So this power button has a little knob and it has an indent. So you want to take the phone, you want to insert the top and slide it up to the very top of the device and start snapping it into place from the top down. Making sure it's nice and snug, pushing it all the way down to make sure all the connectors fit into the place correctly. Now it does snap fairly difficult in some places, especially it seems like around the volume button. So just double check and make sure you give it a little bit of room. Make sure that nothing's fallen in place. Make sure there's no tape in between the frame and the volume button. And go ahead and snap our way down. Now before you go too far into the bottom, you want to make sure you snap all the sides to make sure everything's functioning and everything's in place. Giving a little extra force to snap it back into place. Now, like I was saying, this back was glued onto this phone. You could re-adhere it with glue. To be honest with you, don't find it necessary. I always get a nice tight fit from the device, even if I don't use glue. What you can do is there's always glue residue. You can heat it up a little bit with a heat gun or a hair dryer for a minute to kind of melt that glue if you're a little concerned about it, and then just make sure you push everything back together once it's there. We're just going to remove all the connectors for the power button. Just double check to make sure the volume button functions properly for us as well. And there you have it. That is a screen replacement on an HTC One M7. If you have questions, go ahead and comment on the video. I will be doing a more in-depth of this phone. I'm going to be changing one from a glacial silver to a black housing and actually replacing the screen. I'll be doing a Loca repair on that phone. So if you want to save a few dollars and your LCD is still functioning properly, you just want to re-glue it down, I'll show you how to do that on this phone as well. It's almost the same process, but it's just a little bit more in depth. If you liked the video, found it helpful, go ahead and hit the like button. Make sure you put your SIM tray back into the phone. Apparently the right direction as well. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I'll have some new videos coming out for you. I have an S4 active, an S4, and a couple of iPhone 5 videos as well. Again, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.